There we are. Piers Robinson. How you doing,
Hi.
Piers? You doing all right today?
I'm doing
Piers
well. Thank you.
Excellent. Piers Robinson is co-director for the Organization of Propaganda Studies. Um, Piers, I was, you may have caught the tail end of that, but just to give you some context so you don't think I'm a madman. Pezeshkian was having a conversation with his press office and basically released a statement. And he says, quote, "We're ready to settle problems between the United States and us on the basis of international norms. We have never demanded anything going beyond our legitimate rights." This is what the press office quoted. He said, "In this context, we welcome any assistance from our friendly and brotherly countries." Now, Pezeshkian is saying this in the context of information coming out that his government wanted to make amends with the U.S. and believed that they could make amends with the U.S. as we were knocking over government after government, as Syria fell, as Hezbollah was decapitated, and that in his mind, we can make amends with them. And we don't want to get too close to the Russians because we think that would hurt us for making amends with the West. Now, you put out a piece where you were pointing out this is, what, 20 years in the making? For them to finally get to the point of overthrowing Syria where they can finally be right there at the doorstep of Iran. And that monster knocked. The notion that all of these people died, I think like nearly 1,000 Iranians died. Yes, they gave Israel a pounding that Israel has not had in my lifetime, not in modern memory. But they paid a toll for that. And the notion that you get snuck attack by the U.S., where they were obviously working in coordination with Israel. Israel wouldn't do it without the U.S. permission, without the green light. And at the end of that, the day later, you're like, hey, we're perfectly open to making amends. And I was showing the audience what Israel was coming out with, where they were effectively saying, we will use a Lebanon model. It says Israel sees Lebanon as this model for ensuring that Iran does not rebuild its weapons. What is the Lebanon model? To effectively get a ceasefire and then go with military strikes and kill people during the ceasefire. And what did Donald Trump put out? Just and I'm letting you come in now. I just want to make this point clear. So you don't think I'm crazy. It's like, why is Jamal being a hard ass about this? Trump puts out a bomb Iran video on his own homepage, on his own social media, with words, as the gentleman points out, we need to kill the Ayatollah. Time for turn Iran into a parking lot, put the Ayatollah in a box, went to a mosque, gonna throw some rocks, bomb Iran. Those are two very different messages that are coming out of these camps. Give me your take on that before we step into the other part.
Okay. I mean, first of all actors in these situations will say things in order to create impressions, and what they say may not be what they actually mean or intend to do. And people are calling bluffs and so on. This in these kind of situations, that is always going on. So, if there's Trump's that video there, I mean, as we're learning with Trump, he's capable of saying very different things one day to the next. So is Tulsi Gabbard, his DNI, obviously, as we have discovered. I mean, some of that might be a symptom of uncertainty and confusion within the ranks, or it might be entirely deliberate and designed to confuse and so on. And at the moment, I'm sort of open to persuasion on either of those. I think in one sense, there is a lot of instability and confusion because in some ways, the US, Israel are in a tight corner at the moment. But in other ways, I think that sort of this idea of, perhaps when you are in those positions of weaknesses, of essentially sort of creating confusion and so on by saying different things, etc., calling for peace in one moment, ceasefire, and then issuing videos such as that helps sort of keep everyone sort of unsure about your actual intentions. It could be even more simple. That video you showed, it could be more simpler explanation in terms of Trump simply trying to, he's going down one particular direction at the moment, but he's simply trying to play to one of his constituencies within the US who are going to warm to that kind of thing. I.e. the Republican sort of bomb them hard mentality, etc. So who knows for sure what exactly is going on. But I think, I think this, saying different things and sending mixed messages, etc., is part of the strategy that all actors employ. Now, in terms of Iran, I think it's what you're suggesting, Iran sort of appearing sort of to go along with this, let's go down the diplomatic path, is you were talking about, and so on. Well, for sure, they're going to be saying that at this point in time. I mean, they've had considerable success in holding off this regime change attempt, and I think it was a serious attempt at toppling the Iranian government. And now in that position of victory, why not play the card of we're open to diplomacy, we're open to finding settlements and so on, because you're maintaining, in a sense, the moral high ground by doing that. So why not? It doesn't mean that they really believe that Trump or the West or Israel, as you rightly pointed out, is suddenly going to give up overnight on essentially, when I say regime change, regime in inverted commas, right? That's CIA.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know. Just
that is going to go away. And even if, for example, and I'm not saying this is the case, even if Trump is who he says he is, and he's going to stick to his agenda of taking America away from these imperial wars, even if that is the case, sorry, my chair's just gone on that.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Please continue talking. I'm still here. I hear water running. I just want to check it, but please talk. I'm listening.
Yeah, even if that is the case, that Trump is maneuvering the US towards, it's still very clear, and it will be very clear to the Iranians that all of those power blocks in the West and that overlaps with Israel, who are hell bent on regime change in Iran, are still there. They're not going to go away, and they're going to try everything within their power in order to make sure that Trump follows through ultimately with, if not sufficient energy put into creating an internal uprising, a full-blown war. And the Iranians will know that. And so I don't think they're going to be so foolish as to think that sort of the road is open to diplomatic settlements now. I suspect they will capitalize upon their military successes, in a sense, shore up their position and wait for the next moves. I suppose the other things I'm hearing from people sort of saying, well, Iran should just keep going. I understand, and no one can be 100% sure what the right tactical decision is at this point in time, and no one knows. No one has a monopoly on the best approach to take. You could see Iran considering, okay, if you're challenging an empire, and the empire is in decline, and if you want to exert enough pressure and force to, as it were, stop that empire from taking you out, you also want to avoid provoking an overreaction at some point, which you can't control, i.e. a dramatic escalation. As some of us were wondering about in the last week, are they actually going to use a nuclear device against Iran, or a kind of escalation where you just have a pretty full-blown air war with American air bases being attacked, the American president coming under more and more pressure to escalate from his domestic base and so on. So Iran might be thinking, this is the smartest move at this point in time. We've, as it were, pushed the bear back, but you don't want to create a situation where the bear overreacts at this point, and then you're handling a bigger military situation than is in your interest at this point in time.
Agreed.
So, I guessing obviously, but I think those are the kind of calculations which might well be going on, certainly from the Iranian side. But I mean, I can't see inside the minds of the people in control in Iran, but I'd be extremely surprised if they are, or if any significant number of them are naive enough to think that this is it, that it's all over, that the war is all over.
Agreed. Yeah. And Piers, I want to say this before I respond. You're fantastic. I still disagree with you.
Okay,
and then let me explain why. I don't think there's any confusion at all in the Trump administration about what they want to do. I think Trump may be shocked that Israel failed, because I suspect that they were probably telling him, hey, we can do this. Hey, we can take them over. We can do all that stuff. I agree with you that it was a putsch attempt, that they were trying to knock the government over. Yeah. I agree with you that Iran was able to beat that putsch attempt back. Totally agree on that front. I think my main issue is Pezeshkian was the guy that wanted to negotiate. despite what was obviously a hostile actor in the situation. The U.S., as I keep pointing out, your very existence is the issue. It's not, you can be one of these submissive Saudi governments or UAE or one of these other governments, but ultimately you don't want to be that. And because you don't want to be that, then you're in a position where you're in opposition just because you exist. And you need to act accordingly to that. And then, like for me, the idea that all of these people died in a sneak attack war, but with the US and Israel working arm in arm together, and your first response a day later, when you know all of those people died as a result of that, is we are perfectly willing to work with the United States. I'm saying even if that's just theater, that looks horrible, especially considering you're the guy that wanted to negotiate in the first place and is skewed, what for all intents and purposes, assistance with Big Brother Bear, where Israel may have never attacked you if indeed you had that association with Russia. I mean, would Israel really risk going after the Iranians if they know, meaning the biggest disadvantage that Iran has in this conflict, and part of the reason why they probably didn't turn Israel to glass is that Israel has nukes. Okay, well, that's leveled off if you're dealing with someone else that has a missile shield over you that also has nukes. They may not have been willing to attack you in this way. Hell, even with the air defense, they may not have been willing to do this, or at the very least may not have been able to kill this many people. Pezeshkian was that guy. And so him coming out immediately saying after like 1,000 Iranians are dead, we're willing to work with the U.S. when the U.S. effectively worked with Israel for
too big a sign of weakness, you're saying, essentially.
It looks horrible. It looks horrible.
Sure, but that's the immediate response, right? And I assume this, because I haven't seen this, I assume this is within the last 24 hours. Is that correct?
Yes.
So,
And one last point, just before I let you jump in. Syria. The U.S. spent, 15 years pecking away at Syria until Syria collapsed. So this is an opening into Iran. This is not, like you said, this is not the end point. Everybody knows that this is just the opening, pecking away at Iran. They've just gotten to the point of being able to knock down Syria where they can finally get to the point of making inroads into Iran. So strength is a bit better here. I'm not saying go bomb stuff. I think I even said that they were correct in not bombing the US base. I didn't even think they were going to respond, frankly. I thought they were just going to focus on Israel. I thought it was even a potential too much of a provocation, not knowing where the US's head was. Because the US could have said, oh my God, you attacked us. Even if it's a fake attack, we're now getting involved. It depends on where their mind was.
Well, it was enough to show intent and capability. I know the missiles were shot down, but of course they were shot down because they only fired 6. It showed, but it demonstrated intent and capability, especially if they'd used hypersonics, which would have got through. So it's sending a very clear message to the Americans.
Don't back us into a corner. Yeah.
Well, if this carries on, this is where it will end up. And so on.
So I guess I don't fully disagree. I guess I just disagree in the context.
I don't disagree. I think it's important. That's one single statement. We need to see in the coming weeks, unless the situation just kicks off again, we need to see how the various elite blocs within Iran maneuver and respond. You're talking about, obviously, the Prime Minister obviously making this response in the statement and so on, but then we're going to have to see what he says and how other blocs within Iran. So I know there has been this criticism, and my colleague David Miller makes this, that the Iranian elite has moved into space of sort of co-optation / cooperation, which is bad, which is not recognizing the reality of the regime change objectives.
Exactly.
But we've just been through what we've been through. And the rhetoric didn't stay on nuclear program for very long. It shifted straight to regime change. And of course, they were triggering assets within Iran, trying to overthrow the Iranian government. So, it's going to be very, very difficult to hold the line within the Iranian political establishment that these guys really want to have negotiations and peace and settlements with us. I think that the hand will be the hand of essentially those who do recognize the reality of Iran's the threat to Iran's existence, their hand will be strengthened by what has happened over the last few weeks. And so let's see how this plays out in the coming weeks. And I agree, if in a few weeks' time, we have Iran just falling into the trap of playing along with these, essentially all of these deceptions by the West and Israel, then, yep, you're right, they haven't learned the lesson. But that might not be the case. We've been through a very significant event, I think, over the last 12 days, which is effectively, and they have resisted what they wanted to achieve. And I bet the kind of communication, again, this question of where is Trump in all of this, I bet it's very plausible that Trump was told by his advisors, this will be just like Syria. We've just toppled Assad and so on. Because you saw the same kind of nonsense being delivered to Bill Clinton over Kosovo in 1999, when Madeleine Albright was saying it will be as easier as Bosnia 95 and Operation Deliberate Force and so on. And he sort of bought into that sort of comparison that his advisors were making. Madeleine Albright was saying this, and went ahead and bombed and just made the situation much, much worse. And I'm betting this kind of flawed analogy with Syria, that's the kind of argument which might have been put to Trump, which made him think, hey, yeah, this is an opportunity here. We've just dealt with Syria. Now we can do Iran and so on, and just went for it. But, it's failed. It's failed very spectacularly. I think Iran has probably taken now the opportunity to deal with, to a very large extent, a lot of these sleeper cells which were in the country. I saw that 3 people were executed today by the Iranian authorities. So, they're going to be on top of that. Sorry?
I think it was like 700 people arrested, something like that.
Right. Okay.
With pipe bombs, drones, etc.
They're going to be, in a sense, it'd be difficult to make the argument, as I said, that the West and Israel is not intent on the overthrow of the Iranian government. And they have access to all the information that you and I do. I bet they've seen Wesley Clark's 7 countries in 5 years, etc. They know what's going on. And I think their hand will be strengthened, certainly in relation to the moderates and so on. There'll be a whole rally effect around, sort of Iran's success over the last 12 days, and that will mobilize the population. So we'll see. But to, in a sense, agree with what you're saying to an extent, it has to be all of us need to be extremely sort of aware and cognizant that this isn't over, that the West and Israel are going to continue to maneuver. And I think there's parallels with Ukraine. I mean, we have the NATO summit going on at the moment. I mean, these are 2 of the flashpoints of the Western Empire sort of attempt to maintain hegemony, one against Russia, one in the Middle East to try to take out Iran finally after all these years. And these drives are clearly not going away. There's clearly no suggestion that NATO is going to back down from its belligerent stance in relation to Russia. And these are big conflicts. These are huge conflicts which can escalate and so on. So, the war machine is pushing hard still, and it's going to push hard on Iran, undoubtedly. So we all need to be very, very aware of that. And I agree. So in a sense, I empathize with the sentiment of don't get fooled. And any sign that Iran is going to get fooled is worrying, and one should speak out against, or try and highlight that this is a bad move and so on. So.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying this stuff out of a bad place. I'm saying out of angst. I've seen what happened to Syria. I was around when Libya collapsed, when Iraq collapsed. All those people died. And it's almost like you could see the movements. I mean, Israel was very straightforward. Hey, we've taken down Syria. Now we can go after Iran. And there was a huge amount of pressure on Donald Trump to do it. I also agree with you about the maneuvering of presidents. I've had Colonel Wilkerson on the show. And Colonel Wilkerson was pointing out, and not just Colonel Wilkerson, Command Chief Dennis Fritz, I forget, there was somebody else who pointed out the way presidents get maneuvered, where they would tell them, hey, here's the intelligence. Everything looks great. I know we can do this. This is what's going to happen. Larry Johnson was saying that they were telling Trump Iran is running out of missiles, which sounds very familiar to Russia's running out of missiles. They're fighting with shovels, this stuff. And you have somebody who's not all that much cognizant of the world, doesn't know much about foreign policy, is just kind of a business guy, and he wants to win. And he thinks, I think you're right. This can be like Syria. We can overthrow it. I can be shaking Jelani's hand. You're, tough guy, good looking beard, or whatever the hell he was saying. And Trump might have been shocked when it fell apart. Like he was crowing the first day. 48 hours later, he's like, we don't have anything to do with this. Don't hit our boats. It's just astonishing. People thought he had dementia. What do you think? No, please.
Right, sorry, I cut you off.
No, please. I was just going to say, what do you think it goes from here? But please, make your point.
Well, no, I was just going to say sort of Trump's, and of course this is humorous, although this is a grim situation, Trump's use of the F word in front of the presidential helicopter before being flown off, presumably to go to NATO summit. It does kind of make you think, did he at that point feel somewhat misled by his advisors over the last few weeks, precisely that sort of this is going to work, and it hasn't worked, and they've had to effectively, I mean, it appears at least to have, they're the ones who blinked first, right? Not Iran,
right,
and so on. So he's angry, and hence the F word comes out. I mean, I remember reading sort of literature surrounding sort of Bill Clinton over Bosnia and Serbia, and apparently he used to sort of hit the roof when I think it was NATO soldiers to buildings saying don't carry out airstrikes and so on, and he's absolutely livid and swearing in the Oval Office and so on. So I wonder if there's a little bit of that going on, but again, it's this idea of the leaders being misled and maneuvered into various positions, and then when it all goes wrong, they realize that they have been, as it were, in a sense, they're a little bit misled. So I think that could be going on, but who knows, maybe there's absolutely no uncertainty, and Trump's knows exactly what he's doing and so on. It doesn't change the fact they're still in a difficult position now following what has happened.
Go into that.
Where this goes from that? Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no. I was just saying, go into that for me, because you said they are in a difficult position now going forward.
I mean, where this goes from here is that I think. Okay, let's think of this in broad terms. The war machine is not giving up the ghost, as in the elite groupings in the West and so on, and their allies in the Middle East are holding to the line of in the Ukraine and in the Middle East, and that clearly there's no signs of that coming to a halt in the immediate future. At the same time, I only see the West's position as considerably weakened. I think that the genocide against Palestinians has isolated the West globally, and that's not going to go away anytime soon, probably never. So this kind of the whole moral legitimacy of the West, which when you think about it, Western imperialism has always been built upon this idea that we are the force for good in the world. There's a white man's burden, all of these things which build up the ideology of the West. That's fundamentally undercut now by what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians in Gaza and continue to do. So, that legitimacy crisis is going to persist. And the military crisis of the Western Empire, I think, has really become very, very clear in the Ukraine. I think that the hypersonic missile issue, and you've seen this playing out with Iran and Russia in Ukraine, the inability of our military to actually defend against those systems because they're simply too fast, and we don't have these missiles, means that we have a crisis of military credibility. And I think I would suggest that's very significant, and that will be running through the veins of a lot of the military commanders. For example, a commander who's been asked to, you've got to take your guys, your aircraft carriers into the Straits of Hormuz and so on. And what's going to be going through his mind or her mind is this, can I protect my people? And the answer is no, you can't. This is not Top Gun in the 80s, where American imperial dominance, and it's true, was underpinned by overwhelming firepower and ability to project power through its carrier fleets. No one else had this. Absolutely no one else in the world, and so on. And that simply isn't the case. That kind of supremacy is gone. So I think those are the two big, one could call them more structural problems that the West has, is the declining credibility of its military capability, and then the legitimacy absolutely undermined by the genocide. And I'm leaving out the economics, right? The West, I mean, if you look at anywhere in the West, either the US or in Europe, you see societies which are significantly, which are struggling with poverty, division, polarization, and so on. So, we are not the countries that we were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so on. And, if you want to go rolling around the world playing sort of we're the imperial master here and mobilizing troops to go into war zones and so on, you need some level of cohesion back home amongst your population. And I don't see that. I was in LA a couple of years ago, and I was just shocked at the people on drugs everywhere, parks full of people sleeping in tents and so on.
Yes.
These are problems across the West. So we have a lack of internal cohesion. And I think if you add these big things together, I think that going forward, we're obviously in a bumpy ride. We're obviously being controlled and led by people who, A, are extremely dangerous, and B, have completely absorbed their own propaganda, drunk their own Kool-Aid and so on about Western supremacy and how we're going to defeat Russia, how their missiles will run out in a couple of days kind of thing. And so we have got a problem with the people we have in charge. As I say, I mean Western populations. And so this is going to be a bumpy ride. But I think that the bigger picture structural reality is that this is one-way path of imperial decline, whether we like it or not. Whatever people try and do to try and shore up Western hegemony is not going to work. So, we're in for a bumpy ride. Reality will exert itself finally upon the West and Western elites. I just hope that not too many more people have to be killed in the meantime before that happens.
Yeah, that's the terrifying part, right? It's like how when people get desperate, drowning man, they just grab onto anything. And as you point out, like the propaganda studies thing is pertinent to this. I mean, when we have our big glossy stores, when we're competing against the Soviet Union and we're making our argument, well, we're a better society is because, they're a repressive state and we're open. Look at our stores, look at Hollywood. Okay, that's a hell of an argument to make. But as you point out, California, I was shocked by how bad California was when I was sent for an assignment. Like my first time seeing a drug needle, California. People shooting up in the dark spaces of the hotel, even though it was a pretty decent hotel. Hundreds of thousands of people are homeless. That's the state. I remember meeting this guy in Egypt, and he was like, I've never seen anything like it. And like he's telling me about shanty towns in California when we're in Egypt, which is not necessarily the most richest country on the planet. That propaganda gets more intense. It has to, because it has to cover more. And so, you have to go after people on social media. Germany has to kick down doors, grab people and take them away from tweeting something. The UK does have to go after, Richard Medhurst, because they don't like what he's saying. Or the EU has to kick out those journalists because they don't like what they're saying in regards to, I think there was like 2 Russian correspondents, or they were Europeans, but they were covering like Russian media or something like that. And they effectively kicked them out the EU. That is outrageous. And that's not what I think of it from a liberal government or from, let's say, a liberal society. The U.S. has a First Amendment, so we're a little bit more insulated from it, but they still try to find ways around it. Give me the role of propaganda in all of this. I mean, because even with Iran, they're going to show footage of, oh my God, Iran hit a hospital. And it's like, dude, Israel hit 93% of the hospitals in Gaza. Are you really making this argument right now? Or I was showing this video of this woman at an apartment complex saying, oh my God, it split the apartment in half. It just split it in half. This like, she was like, these animals. Effectively what she's trying to argue, right? And I would show the video of Gaza like, this is what they have done. How are you making this argument? It's like you're prick us and we bleed and scream, despite the fact that we're, going after people with a machete. It's amazing. Look, I got to be honest with you. I didn't notice it until working at a radio station. And you watch that stuff and you're like, whoa, they are repeating stuff that is not indicative of reality, per se, or at the very least drops context. Dig into that for me. Because the attacks on Iran, on some level, demands that level of propaganda. How else do you justify, well, they're getting a bomb? The IAEA, no. Tulsi Gabbard, no. Okay, what are you using for this? Well, the Israelis told us. Oh, really? Is that what you're going with, huh? Give me a take on this.
Well, I think, I mean, in one sense, you're correct that the propaganda is extreme because the situation is extreme, and you know, none of this can be maintained unless you, as it were, you crank up the propaganda campaigns. And we've been in a world for some time now where Western foreign policy is so extreme that, you know, if anyone who has the vaguest inkling of what is actually going on, they look at the mainstream media and they just think, well, that's an utter inversion of reality. It's not even what you describe as a partial take on reality. It's just an inversion of reality and so on. And of course, in the simplest way, Western propaganda is all about we're the side of justice and right and so on, and we are the side who is always, you know, sort of okay, we're the ones who are victims of external aggression and so on. Whereas in reality, the opposite is the case. You know, we're the ones who are attacking other countries, and we clearly, you know, do not hold this kind of position of moral supremacy in the international system. We're actually the bad guys and so on. So, you know, Western publics have to be told all of these things because, you know, if they knew the reality, they wouldn't accept it. I mean, this is, you know, John Mearsheimer's point, actually, in a related issue in his book, Why Leaders Lie, which was from 2010. And he talks about the way in which deception is an integral part of politics. And if you think of sort of propaganda and deception as overlapping, which they are, not all propaganda is deception, but they certainly do overlap and so on. That Western country, you know, in Western populations, you know, because they will not sort of tolerate governments invading countries for unjustified reasons and so on, and you know, all wars, you know, according to liberal principles, need to be fought within the framework of international law, etc. Because that's a basic norm in Western societies. But when that isn't happening, Western governments, more so than authoritarian governments, have to engage in lying and propagandizing their publics and so on. That's sort of the point that Mearsheimer was reaching for in his book, and I think that is the case. You know, we do need to tell our publics very big lies because we have been acting as an empire. We have been attacking countries, exploiting countries for many decades, and you know, the only way you're going to be able to carry that with enough of the population is if you just tell them lies about what's going on. So you tell them that sort of, you know, we're here for a humanitarian intervention to help people, when really you're there simply to overthrow a government and, you know, make a country open to your own big companies to exploit and so on. So, you know, propaganda is integral in all societies, but particularly for the West, and when it comes to Western foreign policy, because you just got to tell people lies, otherwise they won't tolerate the policies which are pursued. I think the problem now is that, of course, we're in a world where people don't really trust the mainstream media anymore for very good reason. More and more people absorb their information from people such as you and all of the other independent media, and there's a huge sort of vast ocean of that now, which enriches, I think, sort of public understanding of what's going on. And, you know, that causes them to maybe clamp down, as you were just describing, in terms of starting to prosecute people and so on, and that kind of hard-nosed sort of pressuring of controlling the boundaries of dissent and conversation has certainly increased in recent years. But they are, I think, you know, in an uphill struggle in all of this. I think that as soon as they get up to a point where most people aren't really listening to the mainstream media, and you're right, sort of the mainstream media is painful to watch. If you just glance at it for a few seconds, you realize how distorted it is. But do you know what? It's a really small bubble of middle-class professional type people who are still clinging to that as their gospel. Everyone else, I mean, the man and the woman on the street had stopped paying attention a long time ago, and there are more and more people, even into the sort of the professional classes now, who are deviating away from the mainstream media. So this is an increasingly small bubble that the propaganda directly gets pumped to now in the West. And you know, they have various tricks up their sleeve, and you know, the algorithms, the manipulation of social media, that's all in play. But I'd also suggest that there are limits to how much control they can exert on that. In a way, X has been a demonstration of that, or Twitter has been a demonstration of that, and which is why they've moved to this kind of more coercive approach. So you have legislation imposed to try to control disinformation, for example, and then the whole fact-checking regimes which you have created, the censorship industrial complex, as Matt Taibbi described it, and Schellenberger, and so on. But I think even those attempts to control are struggling. I don't know how much people pay attention to fact checkers anymore because they just don't trust them, and so on. I think, the point at which they move to sort of formal censorship, then they've lost themselves completely. Because as you said before, that's basically incompatible with a democracy. So in a sense, they know they can't quite go to there, because otherwise everyone says, well, what are we fighting for? Because we're not, so they lose that part of the narrative. So I think there are limits. And I mean, in Germany here, it was Berliner Zeitung. My wife reads that paper, and she says that they're doing, it's an established mainstream German paper, and they're actually doing a pretty good job of pushing back against the establishment narrative now. So that's one, long-standing mainstream German newspaper, which, and again, it's not going to be perfect. It won't be as good as You and the Independents, but they are at least pushing back against some of the war propaganda and so on. So, I think, as we move further down the road into crisis of Western hegemony, I think you might see more of that happening. We have, a lot of independent media. I know some independent media aren't really then independent as they appear to be. And I'm thinking of Democracy Now!
It's like here's some dollars, right? right.
But there are lots of pretty good independent media. So there's a lot of, pluralization of discourse going on there. And then you have maybe some of the established media, maybe one or two of them will break rank, in time. We'll see. I have no faith in the UK. I mean, the Guardian, the Times, and the Telegraph, I think, are so riddled with, I suspect, intelligence-linked actors. There's no hope for them. I assume it's the case in the EU. What would your view be on CNN? Is CNN ever likely to? Probably not.
No, I don't see it. I mean, it's like you have to read between the lines on that stuff. It's kind of like Mark Twain said, like you read the news to figure out what they're talking about now for what's true. It's like, and sometimes you're like The Guardian, I think it was The Guardian or one of those articles that says contractors are coming in order to help walled communities. Okay, they're talking about concentration camps, or they're talking about, they're referring to areas in Gaza where they've cordoned people off into these camps where Israel has been killing these people. And they describe it as like walled communities. And it's like, okay, dude, are you serious right now? Or they use this very passive language when they're talking about people getting killed, but they use very aggressive language when they're talking about, somebody else getting killed that they don't like. That it's so over the top, but you have to kind of read between the lines, and you'd be surprised at the stuff they would admit, 10 paragraphs down, line 59 or something like that. It's there. It's just so heaped on with certain language and the way they say it and this kind of weird context. No, it's very strange the way that stuff works. But this stuff, it puts you around a Hunger Games. It's like it's there in pursuit of it. It's almost like the media is not an independent actor. The media is never an independent actor. Like you can't even keep a war going without the media being okay with the fact that you're pursuing a war. And as you point out, the language that they use, how they talk about something, the framing that they give to it. Like US, for example, would say, well, the question and the framing of it would be, does Iran have a bomb? Because if you frame it that way, it's, well, if they do, somehow it justifies us going and killing a lot of people. If they don't, then somehow it doesn't justify it, as opposed to the entire question being somewhat ludicrous. Israel has a nuclear bomb. Is it okay for us to go and bomb Israel? Well, that doesn't come up. Right? That's not that's not part of the conversation.
Outside the frame of reference.
Yeah, it's so wild. Like the way they frame these conversations, because the framing is the thing that allows you to accomplish an objective either way. Like meaning whether that answer is yes or no, it's an argument. And the very fact that people are arguing makes you think that they're arguing about something legit, which creates a justification either way, because at that point you're just dealing with a poll that says, well, 40% don't think they do, 50% think they do. So it makes it okay that the president does it. It's wild the way, I don't know. It's once I got into media, you start paying more attention to the way the media functions. I don't know. Piers, last question, last comment before I let you go. Does Iran get a bomb?
I think I'm probably with sort of Mearsheimer's analysis on this, that that's in the absence of a serious attempt, picking up on what you just said, on a serious attempt to get Israel to surrender its nuclear capability, that's the most sensible path for Iran to adopt. And again, it's linking back, especially given what we were saying before, is that the forces driving for overthrow of the Iranian government are not going to go away anytime soon. So, and of course, that was Mearsheimer's provocative argument, wasn't it, years back? The safest world is one where just about all the major players have nuclear weapons, and so on, to create stability and so on. So, I won't go quite as far as that. I'd say in the absence of, because you're right. I mean, it's such an elephant in the room, Israel's nuclear capability. And so the fact that that's never on the table for discussions and so on. So in the absence of that, it's the only logical course for Iran to pursue, I would suggest. And even if you do point at like the B-2 bombing of those nuclear stations, as Scott Ritter does, that this is just symbolic and so on. There was nothing there, etc. I mean, It's still demonstrating intent. I mean, if you had an Iranian bomber dropping those kind of weaponry on U.S. soil and so on, it would focus the mind and so on. So
excuse me, Piers. Excuse me. I hate to interrupt you, but our leaders said that we weren't bombing Iran; we were just bombing their nuclear sites.
Yeah, I know the whole sort of Bill Clinton. I didn't inhale, and all of these kind of things which politicians say, which you kind of cause you to pause. And
depends on what your definition of is, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
Piers Robinson, my man, thank you for this, man. I
good to talk.
I always appreciate you joining me. I really do. Where can people find you? I have a co-director for the Organization for Propaganda Studies, and I have, obviously you're on Twitter at Piers Robinson 1. But is there anywhere else that people can find you?
Yeah, also International Center for 9/11 Justice. I'm the research director there, so people can check me out there. But most of my sort of work and affiliations are on my Twitter handle, which is, I think, Piers.Robinson1. And also still, as you know, still working away on the OPCW Syria chemical weapons issue, and a lot of material on that on the Berlin Group 21 website, because that issue is still rumbles on, and relevance again. I think given what we see with the IAEA, corrupted international organizations, OPCW, IAEA, there's a pattern here of the use of these organizations to rubber stamp regime change wars and so on. So
apparently Grossi was giving over information to the Israelis, in which they used to kill scientists. And to make that even worse, as the OPCW thing is not minor, it's not trivial. They used that as a tool to overthrow Syria, which is what allowed them to get closer to Iran to make this attack in the first place. Like, that's
absolutely. I mean, people used to say to me that the OPCW, this is just that small matter of chemical weapons allegations in Syria. It's a huge issue, and it's a huge case study of the way in which these international organizations established supposedly to maintain peace have actually become essentially mechanisms for war, as triggers for war, and of propaganda for war. And so, it's a huge issue, and it continues to play on, as you say, both in terms of that material sense that the Syrian government was overthrown, creating the conditions for the current attack on Iran, and so on. But Iran, you have the IAEA, as you said, that there seems to be a lot of information coming out now that they were compromised. And there's a pattern here. You go back to Iraq, 2003, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You had Blix offering a degree of resistance. They kicked Jose Bastani out of the OPCW. Remember, John Bolton forced him out in a run-up to the Iraq war because he wouldn't play ball with the US and so on. So they had to rein in the OPCW at that point. and so on. So this is, an incredibly important story of the way in which these international organizations become corrupted, and have been corrupted and serve the purposes of war, which is, of course, the UN was there to stop all of this, right? And these are all UN-linked organizations, so IAEA and the OPCW. So it's a corruption of our sort of cherished institutions, is one way of putting it.
World is falling off its axis. Piers, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. Always enjoy these conversations. I really do. Thank you for this.
Good to talk. Okay.
You have a good one. Be safe, all right?
Bye.